Late at night, when the city had fallen asleep, the phone on the table vibrated persistently, breaking the silence of the small room. Gia Hung, in his sleep, opened his eyes to look at the wall clock. The minute hand had just moved to 2, the hour when most people were fast asleep. Who would be calling at this time? He muttered, reaching out to pick up the phone, but before he could speak, a cold voice rang out from the other end of the line. My mother can't stay here any longer. Take her home tomorrow. Without beating around the bush, without explanation, that voice belonged to Mr. Dung, Gia Hung's uncle, his mother's youngest brother. Before he could respond, he heard a decisive beep. The call ended, leaving a heavy silence in the dark room. Gia Hung stared at the phone screen, his mind blank for a few seconds, then quickly turned into a mess. His mother, Mrs. Lei, had lived with his family for 2 decades, but now just a short sentence in the middle of the night had put an end to everything. Lan, his wife, lay beside him, silently witnessing the entire short conversation. She didn't ask anything, just gently pulled the blanket higher, as if to hide the feeling of unease creeping into her heart. Both of them understood. This was inevitable. 20 years ago, when Gia Hung's father passed away, Mrs. Lei sold the old house, which contained so many family memories, and put all the money into Dung's business to expand his shop. The spacious 3-story house that Mr. Dung now owns also had a large part of that money. When she moved in with his family, everyone thought it was obvious. She was the mother, Mr. Dung was the youngest son, and it seemed like a place she could rely on in her old age. But as time passed, things gradually changed. 20 years. Enough time for a child to grow up, study, and mature for Mrs. Lei. Only in return was a cold sentence at night and a taxi ride to take her to her daughter's house. Gia Hung lay there, thinking about his mother, about the years she had lived quietly in that house, and suddenly realized, from today, his family's life would no longer be the same. The next morning, a taxi stopped in front of Gia Hung's small apartment. Mrs. Lee stepped out, her small figure standing among a pile of flimsy luggage. Opposite, across the street, Mr. Dung and his wife stood with their arms crossed, not hiding their impatience. Not a hug, not a word of advice. Everything ended quickly like a completed transaction. Gia Hung looked at his mother, a choking feeling in his throat. 20 years of sacrifice, just in exchange for a cold moment like this? That evening's dinner took place in a heavy atmosphere. 4 people, Gia Hung, Lan, their son, and Mrs. Lee, sat around the old wooden table. A pot of vegetable soup, a plate of braised meat, a plate of fried fish. Everything was as usual, but no one said much. Mrs. Lee sat at the head of the table, quietly eating small spoonfuls of rice. Lan moved an extra single bed into her son's room, rearranging the corner of the house so that her mother-in-law would have her own place. The 2-bedroom apartment was already cramped. Now with another person, the little privacy the family had became a luxury. That night, Mrs. Lei could not sleep. The ticking of the wall clock echoed in the dark room. She lay there, staring at the ceiling, her eyes heavy with nameless thoughts. Just a few months ago, she was still the head of the kitchen in Dung's spacious house. Every day, she woke up early, prepared breakfast, hung out the clothes, went to the market. Despite her old age, she never let herself be idle. But then, her daughter-in-law, Mr. Dung's wife, said, "You should rest. I'll take care of it." From then on, little by little, she was pushed out of her familiar tasks. Breakfast was prepared by her daughter-in-law. Clothes were washed in the dryer instead of drying in the sun like before. She gradually became lost in the house she had helped build. One day, Dung came home late from work. The meal was cold on the table. The daughter-in-law sighed, and the next day only 3 portions of the meal were prepared. No one said anything, but she understood. She no longer had a place there. The next morning, Gia Hung woke up early, made his mother a cup of hot milk. Mrs. Les smiled and accepted it, but did not drink it. He pulled a chair and sat down, looked at his mother for a long time, then spoke slowly. "Yesterday you called again, told me to come over and get some things that my mother forgot when you have time." She nodded slightly but did not answer. He knew she had not forgotten anything. It was just that the things that belonged to her, she no longer had the right to touch. At noon, she opened the old suitcase. Inside, besides a few clothes, was a small wooden box. Gia Hung recognized it as his father's box of papers. Worn out papers, a few family photos, a savings book with an insignificant balance. But among the pile of yellowed papers, there was a brown covered notebook. She opened it. Inside were meticulously recorded numbers. 450 million for Dung to open a shop, 120 million for house renovations, 30 million for Tet gifts for the grandchildren. She closed the notebook. Numbers don't lie, but people do. Gia Hung held the notebook, turning each page. Not a single line was recorded about the money she spent on herself. No new clothes, no recorded medical visits. For 20 years, she had never thought about herself. The following days, the atmosphere in the house was still tense. Lan tried to cook dishes that suited her mother-in-law's taste, but Mrs. Lay ate less and less. The meal was silent, with only the sound of spoons hitting bowls. Neighbors began to whisper. The old lady was kicked out of the house by her own son. Now she has to live with her daughter. Those words reached Lan's ears when she went to the market. She raised her son for 20 years, and in the end, it's still the same. It's hard to believe that in this day and age, there is still a preference for men over women. Lan walked silently, but those words kept echoing in her head. One afternoon, Lan brought a glass of orange juice into her mother-in-law's room. Mrs. Law sat on the bed, looking out the window. "Drink some water to feel better," Lan said. She turned around, nodded slightly, "Thank you." The words were as light as a breeze, but contained an indescribable sadness. On the weekend, Gia Hung drove to Uncle Dung's house to collect his mother's remaining belongings. The green iron door opened, and inside the three-story house remained unchanged after many years. Mr. Dung stood in the middle of the living room, holding a bunch of keys, his face expressionless. "Your mother's things are upstairs. Clean up quickly and leave." Gia Hung quietly walked up the stairs. His mother's room was at the end of the hallway, smaller than the living room. A simple wooden cabinet, an old bed, a few folded clothes. That was all she had after 20 years. He packed his things into a bag, not taking too much time. When he walked down, Mr. Dung asked, his voice unsteady, "Is your mother okay?" Gia Hung smiled faintly. "My mother is better than ever." Without waiting any longer, he turned and left. The door slammed shut, closing a long, broken relationship. One morning, Mrs. Lay asked Gia Hung to take her to the bank. She held the old savings book, walked into the counter. After a few minutes, she signed the paper, her handwriting slow but decisive. She withdrew all the remaining money, a small amount after 20 years of sacrifice. Then she turned to him and placed an envelope in his hand. "I want you to keep it." Inside was a new bank card bearing his name. "This money is yours," she said. Gia Hung didn't ask what she was going to do, but the answer came immediately. "I want to buy some things for my grandchild." A little light flashed in her eyes, something he had rarely seen since her return. 3 days later, Mrs. Lee was admitted to the hospital. That morning, Gia Hung saw his mother sitting on a chair, her arms clutching her chest, breathing heavily. A prolonged dry cough made it impossible for her to speak a full sentence. Within 30 minutes, she was taken to the emergency room. The doctor announced she had severe heart failure, a disease that had been silently present for many years but had not been properly treated. The small signs, which he had thought were just old age fatigue, turned out to be traces of a big storm. Gia Hung stood by the hospital window, a feeling of helplessness choking his chest. Over the years, he had always believed that his mother was still healthy. Every time she said, "I'm a little tired," he just thought it was normal. Now, everything was too late. That night, in the white hospital room, Mrs. Le opened her eyes and looked at him. "Am I bothering you?" she asked, her voice weak. He clenched his hands, trying to suppress the pain. "Don't say that." She looked at the ceiling, then slowly said, "I've lived enough. All my life, I only thought about others, but when I got old, I realized I had nothing left." There was a long silence. "In the future, if there is anything that belongs to you, keep it. Don't give it all away like I did." Gia Hung lowered his head, regret entwined with him like an invisible string. That night, she slept deeply. Outside, the city was still lit up, but to him, time seemed to have stopped. Mrs. Lee passed away 3 days later. After the funeral, Gia Hung went to the bank with the card his mother left behind. The employee entered the information, then looked at him with a surprised look. "Can you check your password again?" He entered the number his mother had told him. The number that appeared made him speechless. 6 billion VND. Not 60 million as he thought. It was a fortune. She had never mentioned this amount of money, only said it was the last small amount she left him. Images flooded back. The time she refused to buy new clothes, the simple meals of boiled vegetables and braised fish, the money she quietly slipped into his hand. How frugal had she been to earn that amount of money? A year later, Gia Hung used that money to buy a small house in the suburbs. Not big, but enough for his family to start over. On the day of moving, Lan stood in the middle of the living room, whispering, "Mom will love this place." He did not reply, but he knew it was true. The house welcomed a new member, a child named after part of Mrs. Le's name, as a way to preserve the memory of the woman who had sacrificed her whole life for her family. One late afternoon, the sunlight shone through the window. Gia Hung opened his mother's old notebook. He stopped reading the numbers, just quietly skimming through each page, feeling the handwriting and traces of time. She was gone, but her legacy remained forever. After moving to a new house in the suburbs, Gia Hung's family's life gradually regained its original rhythm. The house was not big, but enough for natural light to pour in through the large glass windows, bringing a warm feeling that the old cramped apartment never had. Lan started planting a few small flower beds in front of the porch, and Gia Hung spent the weekend renovating the backyard where he planned to make a small corner for his son to play. But even though the space had changed, Mrs. Lee's absence still left an unfillable void. One Sunday morning, while Lan was busy in the kitchen preparing lunch, the aroma of sour snakehead fish soup wafted out, permeating the entire house. Gia Hung sat at the dining table, flipping through the newspaper, but his eyes unconsciously left the page, heading towards the kitchen. The scent was so familiar, it reminded him of his childhood, when his mother, Mrs. Lee, would stand by the wood stove, carefully seasoning each spoonful of the soup to make it just right. Back then, the family was poor. Snakehead fish was often a luxury, but every time he was sick, she would always find a way to make this dish, saying that eating it will make you feel better right away. "Where's my son?" Lan asked, still stirring the pot of soup gently. "Playing in the yard," Gia Hung replied, his voice low. He stood up, walked to the window, and looked out. The child, now almost 5 years old, was busy pushing a toy car back and forth across the ground. The boy bore part of Mrs. Lei's name, Min Lei. Lan named him that without explaining much, but Gia Hung understood that it was her way of preserving a little memory of his mother. Lan placed the pot of soup on the table, smiling slightly. "Today, I cooked it the way my mother taught me before. I don't know if it's the same." Gia Hung sat down, scooped up a little with a spoon, and brought it to his mouth. The taste, slightly sour, aromatic with a hint of chili, was almost like what he had eaten from his mother's hands. Not exactly the same, but enough to make his heart suddenly warm, followed by a sharp pain. He said nothing, just nodded. Very similar. Lunch that day was quiet, but not as heavy as the first days Mrs. Lee had lived with them. Minla sat in the middle, chattering about stories from kindergarten, about how he drew a picture of a fish and was praised by the teacher. Gia Hung listened, smiling occasionally, but his eyes were still lost somewhere, as if searching for a figure that was no longer there. One drizzly afternoon, when Gia Hung was cleaning up the work corner in the room, he accidentally dropped his mother's old wooden box from the shelf onto the floor. The lid of the box opened, revealing old papers, a few family photos, and a brown-covered notebook that he had looked through many times. But this time, among the messy pile of papers, an old envelope fell out. The edges of the paper yellowed, the handwriting on it faded with time. He picked it up, immediately recognizing his mother's handwriting. The envelope had no recipient's name, only a short line, "For when you need it." His hand trembled slightly as he opened it. Inside was a short letter, written in blue ink, the handwriting shaky but still clear. "Gia Hung, my son, if you read these lines, perhaps I am no longer here. I am not good at sweet words, nor do I know how to express my feelings like other people. But I want you to understand that everything I have done, from selling the old house to living frugally for so many years, is for you and Uncle Dung. I have no regrets, only regret that I did not keep anything for myself. The money in the bank card is what I saved for my small pension from the times I didn't buy this and that to save for you. I don't want you to suffer like me. I don't want you to live without a place to call home. Use it to build your own life. Don't give it all away like I did. I love you more than anything in the world. Live well, my child." Gia Hung sat silently. The letter in his hand felt like 1,000 pounds. He had never known that his mother had written this letter, nor had he expected that she had silently saved every penny for so many years to leave him such a large sum of money. 6 billion dong? Not a small amount, but what hurt him the most was the silent sacrifice behind it. The times she refused to buy new clothes, the meals with only boiled vegetables, the nights he stayed up all night when he was sick, all were part of this final gift. He folded the letter, put it back in the box, and looked out the window. The rain was still falling, each drop rolling down the glass, like tears that his mother had never let him see. A few weeks later, when Gia Hung was driving home after work, his phone rang, an unknown number. He picked it up, and the voice on the other end of the line made him pause. "Hung, it's you, Mr. Dung." He was silent for a few seconds, trying to stay calm. "Is there something wrong? You wanted to see me for a moment. Are you free this weekend? Can I come to your house?" Mr. Dung's voice faltered, no longer as cold as before. Gia Hung did not want to see this uncle again, the one who pushed his mother out of the house without hesitation. But there was something in Mr. Dung's voice that made him curious. "Okay, I'm free on Saturday afternoon." As scheduled, Mr. Dung appeared in front of Gia Hung's house on an expensive motorbike, but his face was tense. He was not alone. His wife, Miss Hua, was also there, holding a small gift bag. Lan opened the door, said nothing, and quietly returned to the kitchen to continue working. Mrs. Lee had gone far away, but Mr. Dung's presence still carried an indescribable feeling of discomfort. Mr. Dung put the gift bag on the table and slowly said, "Hung, you actually have something to ask me." Gia Hung sat opposite, his eyes cold. What is it? The thing is, your store is having difficulties. The interest rate on bank loans is too high. Can you help me a little? No beating around the bush, no politeness. Gia Hung could hardly believe his ears. After everything that had happened, after his mother had given Mr. Dung the 3-story house, after she had been pushed out of his life, now he was here to ask for more? My mother is no longer here, Gia Hung said, his voice even. The last money she had, she left to me. I have nothing to give you. Mr. Dung frowned, looking incredulous. I know your mother gave you a lot, but do you think she still has some savings of her own? Lan from the kitchen put the knife down hard on the cutting board. She stepped out, looking straight at Mr. Dung. 10 years ago, your mother gave you all the money to open the shop. For the past 20 years, she has lived with you without asking for anything. How much more do you want now? The atmosphere suddenly became heavy. Mr. Dung's wife cleared her throat, trying to salvage the situation. Sister Lion, you know that you haven't taken good care of your mother these past few years, but the store is really struggling now. Just help this time. Gia Hung stood up, interrupting. My mother has given everything away. There's nothing left. Mr. Dung sighed and stood up. His wife gave a polite smile before they both left. The gift bag remained on the table, untouched. After that meeting, Gia Hung never heard from Mr. Dung again. His family's life gradually stabilized in the new house. Min Lee grew up, started going to elementary school, and every time the boy brought home a painting or a high-scoring assignment, Lan smiled, just like Grandma in the past. But for Gia Hung, each passing day brought with it a mixed feeling of peace and regret. He often sat alone in his office, opened his mother's old notebook, and reread the numbers and lines she left behind. Once, he found a small piece of paper stuck between the pages on which was written only, Son, don't be angry with him. I chose this way because I want him to have a better life. He folded the piece of paper, his heart heavy. His mother had forgiven him, had sacrificed until the last moment, but he couldn't. Not because he didn't want to, but because he didn't understand why she chose that way. Chose to sacrifice her whole life for someone who never appreciated it. One afternoon at the end of the year, when the sunset dyed the small yard yellow, Gia Hung stood watching Min Lei playing with her new bicycle. Lan walked out holding a glass of water and said softly, Do you think Mom will be happy to see us like this? He turned back, looked at his wife, and nodded. Mom always wants us to be happy. Then don't let her down, Lan said, her voice soft but firm. That night, Gia Hung sat at the table, writing a short line in his mother's notebook. The first line he had added in many years. Don't worry, Mom. I will live well and will keep what belongs to me. He closed the notebook, placed it on the shelf next to the photo of him and his mother when they were children. Outside, the winter wind blew, carrying the breath of a new beginning. In the first days of living in the new house, Gia Hung often opened his mother's old wooden box, not to search for anything specific, but as a way to feel her presence. Next to the brown-covered notebook and the yellowed letter, he discovered a few other small pieces of paper, scattered notes, undated but containing pieces of Mrs. Lee's life that he had never known. One piece of paper read, The day Hung turned 3, my mother had to sell her gold bracelet to buy milk. He cried all night because he was hungry and all she could do was hug him and cry. Another piece read, The year my father passed away, my mother sat next to a cold tray of rice, watching the 2 brothers sleep, not daring to cry out loud, afraid to wake them up. Those short lines seemed to open a door leading him back to the past, a past that his mother had never fully recounted. Mrs. Lee was born into a poor farming family in the central region, where the land was barren and the crops depended on erratic rains. She grew up with calloused hands from helping her parents in the fields, and when she was 18, she followed Gia Hung's father, Mr. Tan, to the city to start a business. They got married in a simple wedding with only a few trays of rice and blessings from the neighbors. Their lives were not easy. Mr. Tan worked as a construction worker, Mrs. Le worked as a seamstress to earn extra money. When Gia Hung was born and then Mr. Dung a few years later, the burden on her shoulders became heavier. Gia Hung vaguely remembered his childhood days, when his mother often stayed up late at night with the old sewing machine, the steady sound of her feet echoing in the dilapidated wooden house. Once he asked, Are you tired? She just smiled. I'm tired, but seeing you sleep well makes me happy. He was still young, he didn't fully understand the meaning of that sentence, but now when he rereads the lines on the note, he realizes that she had lived her whole life just to take care of her children. When Mr. Thon passed away from a serious illness, Mrs. Lei was just over 40. Gia Hung was 15 at that time, and Mr. Dung was only 10. She didn't cry in front of her children, but every night he heard her sobbing from her bed. To support the 2 brothers, she sold the old house, which used to be the family's home, and moved in with Mr. Dung's family after he got married. That was the beginning of 20 years of sacrifice that ended with only a cold call in the middle of the night. Gia Hung and Mr. Dung were very close. As the older brother, Gia Hung often gave in to his younger brother, from delicious food to more comfortable clothes. When Mr. Dung grew up, he helped him find a job, even borrowed money from friends so that he could have capital to open a small business. At that time, Mr. Dung always said, "Mr. Hung is the best brother in the world. When you succeed in the future, you will never forget my kindness." Gia Hung just smiled, not thinking much, because to him, that was the responsibility of an older brother. But everything changed when Mr. Dung married Ms. Hua. Ms. Hua was 3 years older than Mr. Dung, a pragmatic woman who always calculated every penny. After the wedding, Mr. Dung gradually distanced himself from Gia Hung. The meetings were rare, the calls became less frequent, and then there were only polite greetings on holidays and Tet. Gia Hung did not blame, thinking that his younger brother already had his own family, so being busy was normal. When Mrs. Lee moved in with Mr. Dung, Gia Hung felt secure because he thought his mother would be well taken care of. Mr. Dung once promised, "Mom, just stay with me. I will take care of you for the rest of your life." But that promise, it turned out, was just lip service. Over the years, Gia Hung realized that his younger brother had changed, no longer the innocent boy who used to run after him to share a dumpling, but a man caught up in the vortex of money and ambition. The last meeting between Gia Hung and Mr. Dung, when he came to ask for money, was the last straw. Gia Hung was not angry because Mr. Dung asked for money, but because of his indifference towards his mother. For 20 years, Mrs. Lei lived with Mr. Dung's family, not only giving away her assets, but also her heart. But in the end, he only saw her as a financial resource to exploit. As time passed, the small house in the suburbs became a peaceful shelter for Gia Hung's family. Min Lei grew up quickly, now a lively boy who loves to draw and often asks naive questions about his grandmother. "Does Grandma like to draw, Dad?" he once asked while sitting at the table, holding a box of colored pencils that Grandma Lei bought before she passed away. Gia Hung smiled. "Grandma doesn't draw, but she likes to do everything to make me happy." Lan still keeps the habit of cooking sour snakehead fish soup every weekend as a way to remember her mother-in-law. She doesn't say it, but Gia Hung knows she also has a regret in her heart. Regret for not understanding Grandma Lei better when she was alive. "Back then, I just thought Mom was healthy. I didn't expect her to hide her illness for so long," Lan once confided one evening when the couple sat on the porch looking at the starry sky. Gia Hung nodded, not answering. He also blamed himself. Every time Grandma Lee said Mom is a bit tired, he just told her to rest, but never thought of taking her to the doctor. Now, knowing that she had been silently suffering from heart failure for many years, he just wanted to turn back time so that he could do something, even if it was just to take her to the hospital. One day, while cleaning the bookshelf, Lan accidentally found another envelope in Mrs. L's wooden box. This envelope was thicker, tied with a frayed parachute cord. "Look at this," Lan said, handing it to Gia Hung with a curious look. He opened it. Inside there was not only a letter, but also a few handwritten notes and an old photo, a photo of Mrs. Lei standing in front of the old wooden house, holding a young Mr. Dung in her arms, next to Gia Hung, smiling broadly. The letter was longer than the previous one. The handwriting was still shaky, but clearer. "Gia Hung, I wrote this letter when you had just married Lan for a year. At that time, I was still healthy, but I started to feel pain in my chest every night. I didn't go to the doctor because I was afraid of spending money, afraid of bothering you. I thought if I lived a little more frugally, saved a little, then you would suffer less in the future. I know that you and Dung are no longer as close as before. I don't blame anyone. He has his own life, with pressures that I don't fully understand. When I gave him money to open a shop, I only hoped that he would have a good future. But I was wrong, my child. I gave too much away without thinking of keeping anything for myself or for you. The money in the card is all I have left. I didn't want to tell you too soon because I was afraid you wouldn't accept it. Use it to build a warm home for your family so that Min Lei can grow up in a place where she truly belongs. Don't be angry with Dung, my son. I choose to forgive because I don't want to carry resentment when I leave this world. I'm proud of you always." Gia Hung finished reading, put the letter on the table. He looked at the old photo where his mother smiled brightly with her 2 young sons. She lived her whole life for them, but in the end, only he stayed by her side until the last moment. Mr. Dung, the younger brother she loved no less, chose to turn his back. A few months later, when Gia Hung was fixing Min Lei's bicycle in the yard, his phone rang. It was Mr. Dung again. He hesitated, but still picked up. "Hung, it's you. Are you okay?" Mr. Dung's voice faltered, completely different from his usual confidence. "I'm fine. Is there anything wrong?" Gia Hung asked, his voice cold. "Yeah, he wanted to ask you something. Your shop is having a hard time right now. Hoa told you to sell the house, but you didn't want to. That's the only thing your mother left you." Mr. Dung paused as if waiting for his reaction. Gia Hung was silent. The 3-story house where Mrs. Lei had lived for 20 years was now under Mr. Dung's name. But when he heard him speak, he suddenly understood. He didn't call to ask, but to justify. Gia Hung remained silent, his hand gripping the phone tightly. Mr. Dung's voice on the other end of the line still rang out, hesitant but carrying a despair he had never heard before. You know, Hung, that house is not only an asset but also a memory of your mother. But now you have no other choice. The bank is demanding debt and customers are gradually decreasing. If you sell it, you can pay off all your debts and start over. Miss Hall said so, but you can't bear it. Do you think I can help you again? The space around Gia Hung seemed to stop. He stood in the middle of the yard, the afternoon sunlight shining through the treetops, casting streaks of light on the ground. Min Lei was still engrossed in cycling around the yard, the boys' crisp laughter resounding, but to Gia Hung, every sound seemed to be muffled by Mr. Dung's words. Help again? After everything that had happened, after his mother had devoted her entire life to building that house, only to be pushed out of it by her beloved younger brother, could Mr. Dung still calmly say that? Say something, Hung, Mr. Dung continued, his voice rising slightly with impatience. You know I am your brother, your only remaining relative. Mom is gone, now it's just us. Gia Hung took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. He wanted to scream, wanted to ask Mr. Dung what he had done for her in the 20 years his mother had lived with him, besides taking money and then coldly sending her off in a taxi, but he didn't do that. His mother's words in the letter suddenly echoed in his head. Don't be angry with Mr. Dung, my son. I choose to forgive. He wasn't sure he could forgive like his mother, but at the very least, he didn't want to let his emotions take him away. Mr. Dung, he finally said, his voice even but cold as ice. Your mother left that house to you. That was all she had, and she chose you to entrust it to. I have nothing to help you with anymore. I also have a family, a son to raise. You take care of yourself. The other end of the line was silent for a long time. Then Mr. Dung sighed, his voice gradually softening. You understand, okay? I won't bother you anymore. Goodbye. The beep sounded, ending the call. Gia Hung stood there, looking at the phone in his hand, his heart heavy. Mr. Dung didn't apologize, didn't mention his mother with any regret. There was only a dry plea, as if he were the last bank he could borrow from. Lan stepped out of the house, holding a towel. She looked at him, didn't ask anything, but her eyes were enough for him to know she had heard everything. Are you okay? She said softly, placing her hand on his shoulder. Gia Hung nodded, but deep down, he knew he was not okay. Not because of Mr. Dung, but because he realized a painful truth. His mother had spent her whole life sacrificing for someone who never appreciated it. That night, Gia Hung could not sleep. He lay on the sofa, staring at the ceiling, his mind drifting back to the old days. He remembered the first time Mr. Dung opened a business, a small auto repair shop on the outskirts of the city. On the opening day, his mother came, holding a simple bouquet of white chrysanthemums, smiling brightly when she saw her youngest son cutting the ribbon. She gave Mr. Dung 450 million VND, the largest amount of money she had from selling her old house, and said, keep trying, son. I believe you can do it. Gia Hung was also there that day. He stood next to his mother, watching Mr. Dung busy entertaining guests, feeling proud that his younger brother finally had a good start. But he did not expect that from then on, the distance between the two brothers would grow wider. Mr. Dung was successful. The auto repair shop expanded into a large store. Then he bought a 3-story house, partly thanks to his mother's money, partly thanks to Miss Hoa's clever calculations. Gia Hung was not jealous. He just wanted his younger brother to live well. But when his mother moved in with Mr. Dung, he began to notice small changes. He called him less. The meetings became less frequent, and every time he visited his mother, Mr. Dung always made up an excuse to avoid her. Once, Gia Hung asked his mother, is Mr. Dung taking good care of your mother? She just smiled. He's busy, but I'm fine, don't worry. He believed her and didn't dig any deeper. But now, thinking back, he wondered if his mother was hiding sadness that she didn't want him to know. She had lived in that house for 20 years, but did she ever really feel like it was her home? He stood up, walked to the corner of the room where the wooden box was placed on the shelf. He opened it, took out the brown-covered notebook, and flipped to the page with the amount of 450 million that his mother had given to Mr. Dung. Next to that number, she wrote a small line in pencil. I hope you will remember. Remember what? Remember her sacrifice? Or remember that she had put all her trust in her youngest son? Gia Hung did not know, but he was sure of one thing. Mr. Dung had forgotten. The next morning was a peaceful Sunday. Gia Hung sat in the yard, fixing Minlet's bicycle after he broke a spoke. Minlet sat next to him, holding a box of colored pencils that Mrs. Lei had bought, scribbling on a piece of paper. Suddenly, the boy looked up and asked, Dad, does Grandma like me? Gia Hung paused, his hand holding the wrench trembling slightly. He turned to look at his son, whose eyes were clear, completely unaware of the pain the question had stirred in his heart. Grandma loved you very much, he replied, his voice gentle. Grandma even bought this pencil case for you, remember? Min Lei nodded, grinning. I remember, but why isn't Grandma here with me? The teacher said all grandmas are with their grandchildren. The boy's innocent question was like a knife cutting through Gia Hung's heart. He put down the wrench, pulled Min Lei closer, and hugged the boy. Grandma has to go far away, son, but she's always here, in your heart, in our home. He pointed at the boy's chest, then looked around the small house. Grandma helped Dad build this house so you have a place to play, a place to study. Minla nodded, not asking any more questions, but the boy's eyes were still a bit confused. Gia Hung looked at his son. Suddenly, a determination rose in his heart. He would not let his son grow up without understanding the value of family love, would not let the boy repeat the mistakes that he and Mr. Dung had made. That afternoon, when Minla had taken a nap and Lan was hanging clothes in the yard, Gia Hung sat at his desk, took out a piece of white paper and a pen. He did not know what he was going to write, but something urged him to do this. He began to write, Mr. Dung, I don't know if you'll read this letter, but I still want to write, not to blame you, but to say things I've never said. Mom has devoted her whole life to us, to me, to you, to our family. She sold the old house so you could have a shop, lived in your house for 20 years so you could work in peace. But in the end, all she got in return was a taxi ride back to my house. I'm not mad at you for asking me for money again. I'm mad that you never saw how much Mom sacrificed. The 3-story house you live in, the money you used to expand the shop, all of it was Mom's sweat and tears. But you never asked her if she was tired, if she needed anything. Mom told me not to be mad at you, and I'm trying to listen to her. But I want you to know one thing. From now on, I will live for my family, for my son, the way Mom lived for us. If you need help, I can't give you money, but I am ready to sit down and talk like brothers, like the old days. Think again, Mr. Dung. Mom is no longer here, but what she left behind was not only the house, but also the lessons that you and I both need to learn. He folded the letter, put it in an envelope, but did not send it right away. He placed it in the wooden box next to his mother's letter. Maybe one day he would send it, or maybe not. But writing those lines helped him feel lighter, as if he had just unloaded a burden that he had carried for too long. A few weeks later, Gia Hung took Min Lei to the park near their house. The boy ran around on the grass, holding the kite he had just made for his child. Lan sat next to him on a stone bench, holding a cup of hot coffee. What are you thinking about that makes you so pensive? She asked, tilting her head slightly. I think about Mom, Gia Hung replied, his eyes still following Min Lei. About what she left behind. Not just money, but the way she lived. Lan nodded, saying nothing more. A cool breeze blew by, carrying the scent of freshly cut grass. Min Lei shouted with delight as the kite flew high, and Gia Hung smiled. He suddenly realized that, although his mother had passed away, she had left him a priceless gift, this family, this home, and a chance to live differently, not just for others, but for himself. Time flies like a breeze. The small house in the suburbs is now covered with a light layer of green moss on the walls, traces of the rainy and sunny seasons. Gia Hung is now 45 years old with a few silver strands in his hair, but his eyes remain calm and steadfast. Lan is still the gentle woman by his side. Now she spends more time taking care of the small garden in front of the house where white chrysanthemums, his mother's favorite flower, bloom every spring. Min Lei, the little boy who used to chatter about his grandmother, is now a 15-year-old teenager. He is tall, inheriting his father's resolute face and his mother's bright eyes. Min Lei loves to draw, a hobby that Gia Hung believes he inherited from his grandmother Lei's patience and meticulousness, even though she has never held a brush. Min Lei's paintings are often landscapes, golden rice fields, a quietly flowing river, or pale sunny afternoons on the porch. Once, he drew a portrait of his grandmother based on an old photo in a wooden box, with sad eyes but a warm smile. When he showed it to Gia Hung, he just nodded silently, placing his hand on his son's shoulder. Very similar. Gia Hung's family life was not rich but full. He did not spend the 6 billion VND that Mrs. Lee left him. In addition to buying the house, he deposited a portion in the bank for Min Lee to go to university and invested the rest in a small wooden furniture store, a job that he had loved for a long time but had never dared to try. The store was not big, but it was enough to bring in a stable income, and more importantly, it gave him a sense of freedom that he had never had when he was working in his old office job. Lan often teased, "You are like your mother in this way. You are careful in everything you do, never leaving yourself free." Gia Hung smiled, did not answer, but in his heart he knew it was true. Mrs. Lei taught him how to live responsibly not only towards others, but also towards himself. One summer afternoon when Min Lei had just come home from school, he walked into the house with a small trophy in his hand. "Dad, I won second prize in the school drawing contest," he exclaimed, placing the trophy on the dining table. Lan ran out from the kitchen, hugging her son. "So good, what did you draw to win the prize?" "I drew a small house by the river with an old lady sitting on the porch," Minla replied excitedly. "I imagined it was my grandmother's house in the past." Gia Hung looked at his son, his heart suddenly warming. He stood up, took a wooden box from the bookshelf, opened it, and gave Min Lei an old photo of Mrs. Lei standing in front of the old wooden house. "This is my grandmother's house," he said. "Does it look like the picture?" Min Lei held the photo, looked at it carefully, then smiled. It looks very similar, Dad, but in my picture, my grandmother smiles more happily. His son's words made Gia Hung pause. He remembered his mother's last years when she lived in Mr. Dung's house. Her smiles were rare and always carried an indescribable sadness. Min Lei did not know that, but in his imagination, his grandmother was a happy woman living in the warm little house he drew. Perhaps Gia Hung thought that was his son's way of keeping her in his heart, not as someone who had suffered much, but as a beautiful, complete image. That evening after dinner, Min Lei sat at the desk, flipping open the brown-covered notebook that Gia Hung had shown him a few times. He read the numbers she had written down, the short lines about money and sacrifice, then asked, "Dad, why didn't Grandma buy anything for her? It's all money for Uncle Dung and you." Gia Hung sat down next to his son, his voice low. "Grandma lives for others, my child. She thinks that if Dad and Uncle Dung have a good life, then she will be happy too. But she forgets that she also needs to live for herself." Mindler nodded, but his eyes still had a hint of confusion. "I don't want to grow up and forget myself like Grandma," he said. "I will draw a lot of pictures so that later on Mom and Dad won't have to worry about me." Gia Hung smiled and patted his son's head. "Grandma will be very proud of you." One day in early autumn, when the yellow leaves began to fall gently on the yard, Gia Hung decided to take the letter he had written to Mr. Dung out of the wooden box. He didn't know what prompted him to do so. Perhaps it was Min Lei's words. Perhaps it was the desire to close the past and move on. He revised a few lines, adding a short paragraph. "Mr. Dung, if you read this letter, I hope you will reconsider what your mother has done. I don't expect you to change immediately, but at least live a life worthy of what your mother left behind. My family and I are fine, and I hope you are too. If you want, come visit Min Lei once. She is your niece, and she deserves to know who you are." He put the letter in an envelope, wrote Mr. Dung's address, and took it to the post office to mail it. On the way home, he felt relieved, as if he had just dropped a large rock that he had been carrying on his shoulders for so many years. He didn't expect Mr. Dung to reply, nor did he expect an apology. He just wanted to do what his mother might have wanted, maintain some connection between the remaining members of the family. 2 weeks later, a motorbike stopped in front of Gia Hung's gate late one afternoon. Mr. Dung stepped down, looking thinner than the last time they saw each other, holding a small bag of fruit. Lan opened the gate, her eyes slightly surprised, but she said nothing. Gia Hung stepped out into the yard, looking at his younger brother, unable to hide his surprise. "Did you receive the letter?" he asked. Mr. Dung nodded, his voice hoarse. "Yes, you read it several times before you dared to come. You're sorry, Hung, not because of the money, but because of your mother. You knew you were wrong, but you didn't think much of it at the time. Po told you to sell the house. You refused because it was the last thing your mother left you. But now you can't keep it anymore. The bank is foreclosing on the debt." Gia Hung was silent, looking at Mr. Dung. He didn't feel happy to hear that his younger brother had lost the house, but he didn't feel sorry either. It was the consequence of the choices Mr. Dung had made himself. "So what are you going to do now?" he asked. "You'll start over," Mr. Dung replied, his voice small but firm. "You opened a small auto repair shop, like in the old days. Not big, but enough to make a living." Min ran out of the house, curiously looking at the strange man. "Dad, who is this?" he asked. Gia Hung turned to his son, then looked at Mr. Dung. "This is Uncle Dung, your real uncle." Mr. Dung bent down, smiling awkwardly. "You're so grown up, Uncle. Uncle brought some oranges for you." He held out a bag of fruit, his hand shaking slightly. Min Lei took it, smiling brightly. "Thank you, Uncle." The meeting did not last long. Mr. Dung only stayed for about half an hour, said a few words about his current life, then asked permission to leave. Before getting in the car, he turned back to look at Gia Hung. "Thank you for writing. I won't forget." He nodded, saying nothing more, but in his heart, he knew that the door between them had closed gently, no longer as heavy as before. Many years later, when Minla turned 18 and was about to enter university, he decided to study fine arts. The last picture he drew before leaving home was of a small house by the river, with an old lady sitting on the porch holding a woven basket. Next to her was a boy drawing, and in the distance was the silhouette of a man watching. Min Lei named the picture Grandma's House. He told Gia Hung, "I want everyone to remember Grandma, Dad. She is the most wonderful person I have never met." The picture was hung in the living room of the small house, right next to an old photo of Grandma Lei. Gia Hung often stood in front of it, looking at his son's drawings and smiling. He no longer opened the brown-covered notebook often, but every time he touched it, he could still feel the warmth from the pages. The warmth of a woman who had lived her whole life for her family, and left him with the greatest lesson. Live for yourself, but don't forget to love those around you. One winter afternoon, as Gia Hung sat on the porch, watching Min Lei pack her suitcase to go to the city to study, he suddenly remembered his mother mother's words in a letter. Build a warm home for your family. He did it not only with the money she left, but with the way of life he learned from her. This small house, this family, was Mrs. Lay's true legacy, far beyond the numbers in the savings book. Lan walked out, holding a cup of hot tea, and sat down next to him. What are you thinking about that makes you smile? She asked. I'm thinking about Mom, he replied, and about us. Mom would be so happy, right? Lan nodded, leaning on his shoulder. Outside, Mindley waved. Mom and Dad, I'm going. I'll be back soon. Gia Hung looked at his son, then at the small house, his heart filled with a sense of peace. Mrs. Lee has gone far away, but she is still here, in every corner of this life, in every breath of the family that she sacrificed her life to protect. The morning Minle left home to go to the city to study at university, the sky was blue, with white clouds drifting by. The small house in the suburbs was as peaceful as usual, but today the atmosphere was a bit different, both excited and reluctant. Ji Hung stood in the yard, holding a small suitcase of his son, checking one last time to see if he had forgotten anything. Lan was in the kitchen, preparing a box of rice balls and some fruit for Min Lei to take with her, muttering, going this far, I wonder if he can take care of himself. Min Lei walked out of the bedroom, a backpack on his shoulder, holding a painting of Grandma's house carefully rolled up in a paper tube. He was wearing a white shirt that Lan had ironed last night, looking much taller and more mature than the boy who used to run around in the yard a few years ago. Don't worry, Mom and Dad, he smiled, his voice confident. I'll call you often. Besides, I have Grandma's painting here, so I won't be lonely. Gia Hung looked at his son, feeling a mixture of pride and emptiness. He remembered the day he left home for college, his mother, Mrs. Lee, standing in front of the old wooden house, slipping some change into his hand and saying, study well, son. Don't make me wait. Today, he didn't slip money into Minle's hand. He had a scholarship and some savings from his grandmother, but he still felt like he was repeating that moment. Except now, he was in his mother's position. Remember to stay healthy, he said, his voice low. If anything happens, call me. Don't be shy. Min Lee nodded, then turned to hug Lan. Don't cry, Mom, he teased, even though his own eyes were sparkling. Lan laughed, quickly wiping the corners of her eyes. Who's crying? Be careful on the road, okay? The bus arrived on time, stopping in front of the house. Min Lee waved one last time, got on the bus, and soon, his figure disappeared behind the winding village road. Gia Hung and Lan stood there, watching until the bus was just a small, faint dot. The space returned to silence, with only the sound of the wind blowing through the trees and the chirping of birds somewhere high above. A few days after Min Lei left, Gia Hung received a call from the post office. A letter had arrived, but the sender was not clearly stated. He went to pick it up, holding the envelope in his hand, feeling a little curious. The handwriting on the envelope looked familiar, but he was not sure until he opened it. Inside was a handwritten note, brief but enough to make him pause. Hung, you received the letter I sent you a few years ago, but only now did you have the courage to write again. You sold the house, paid off all your debts, and now live in a small apartment with Hoa. The repair shop is okay, not as big as before, but enough so you don't have to worry about tomorrow. He thought a lot about his mother after reading your letter. He was wrong, Hung. Wrong for not appreciating what his mother did. He didn't expect you to forgive him, but he wanted him to know that he was trying to live differently. Thank you for not turning your back on him completely. If possible, let him say hello to Min Lei. He had never been a good uncle, but he hoped to see her again one day, wishing him and his family good health. Dung, Gia Hung folded the letter, placed it on the table, and looked out the window. The yellow leaves fell gently in the wind, like fragments of old memories gradually fading away. He was not surprised when Mr. Dung wrote the letter. The brief meeting a few years ago had given him a hunch that his younger brother was changing, albeit slowly. But what moved him was the line, "You are trying to live differently." Perhaps after all, his mother was right. Forgiveness is not to forget, but to open up an opportunity for change. He brought the letter into his room, placing it in a wooden box next to his mother's letters and the brown-covered notebook. He did not reply to Mr. Dung right away, but in his heart, he knew that one day, when Minle returned, he would take him to meet his uncle, not to restore a perfect relationship, but to let the boy understand that the family, though broken, was still an indelible part. One afternoon at the end of the year, when the sunset dyed the sky red, Gia Hung sat on a wooden chair outside the porch, holding a cup of hot tea that Lan had just made. The small house now had only 2 people, but it was not empty. The painting Grandma's house hung in the living room, the old photo of Mrs. Lei was placed on the bookshelf, and the white chrysanthemum bushes in the yard seemed to bring her breath back every day. Lan walked out, sat down next to him, and leaned her head gently on his shoulder. Min Lei called today, she said. She said she was drawing a new painting, this time about her parents. She wanted to hang it in her rented room to ease her homesickness. Gia Hung smiled. She is like her mother in that way, always knowing how to warm others' hearts. They sat there, quietly watching the sunset gradually fall. Gia Hung thought about his mother, about the years she lived quietly, sacrificing everything without asking for anything other than the happiness of her children. She had passed away, leaving him not only 6 billion VND, but also a profound lesson. Living for others is noble, but living for yourself is also necessary. He had learned that, and now he was passing it on to Minlei, not through words, but through his own way of life. Do you ever think that Mother is still somewhere, watching us? Lan suddenly asked. Gia Hung nodded, his eyes distant. I believe so, and I believe that Mother is smiling because we have done what she always wanted, to live happily. The wind blew, carrying the scent of chrysanthemums. The wooden chair swayed gently, and in that moment, Gia Hung felt his mother's presence, not in sadness or regret, but in the peace of a family that had found the true meaning of life. Please take a moment to share your thoughts by liking, leaving a comment below, and subscribing to the channel to spread meaningful lessons together. Your support is a great motivation for us to continue to bring more emotional humanity stories. Once again, thank you for watching, wishing you and your family good health, happiness, and peace in life. See you again in the next stories.